Work, activity involving mental or physical effort done in order to achieve a purpose or result. That's the simple dictionary definition, but that's not what we're here to explore. The English term work can be traced to the Old English form of and, along with the Proto-Germanic and, the former meaning performing, producing, and attaining, and the latter meaning operating or setting in motion. There are a few origins that go even further back. We have the Greek term, and the Latin and is where the term labor most directly traces back to, where terms like the French and the Spanish trabajo trace back to. According to an article by The Guardian, these words and those that spawned from them suggest work as coercion, certainly not for the prosperity of the worker, but as a fulfillment of human destiny. They go through the usage and context of the various terms to show how they are intimately connected to concepts of hardship, suffering, and punishment. While it may be argued that and were mainly used for any achievement made through effort, the same can't be said for originated as a tool to restrain unruly animals, and it soon doubled as a tool for punishing and torturing unruly slaves. There's a rich and interesting history surrounding the concept of work, including that of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but I won't be delving too deeply into that for this video. Summing it up with another quote from the Guardian article, quote, "Work was compulsion and punishment, an existential affliction that promised neither well-being nor even an assured sustenance. What I'm more interested in is how language transforms according to the socio-cultural and economic conditions it is situated within. I want to explore how it is used in contemporary society. Sometimes, in an everyday sort of context, we use work in the sense of working on this or working on that. This, we can say, definitively falls in line with the general sense of exerting effort in order to achieve some sort of goal. I'll refer to this as a passive use of the term. It isn't work with a capital W. It isn't work, i.e., the dominant form that pervades our current culture. It isn't I'm going to work, or I can't talk right now because I'm working. That dominant form is intimately associated with your job, your occupation, or what you do for a living. It is the activity you are required to perform in order to exist. It is what you have to do in exchange for the currency you need to exist within our current society. You don't say you are going to work when you are about to begin on a particular task that you consider your hobby. You don't say you are going to work when heading out into your backyard to tend to your personal garden. You don't even say that you are going to work when you are about to begin on your household chores. These tasks are no doubt productive activities where you exert energy or effort into attaining a particular goal or achievement, but what makes them different? Why is one going to work, but the other isn't? One might say that it takes work to tend to a garden, and according to the passive conception of work, that might be true. But some might not consider it work, and they might make the distinction that it is because it's fun and fulfilling. Why this distinction? I know that I don't consider it work when I'm, on my own accord, building a tiny home, gardening, writing, making videos, or performing music. I don't consider it work when I'm doing research, though there are many professions in which going to work might entail any of these activities I mentioned above. The interesting thing about all of this is that we sometimes make the distinction in language, and sometimes we don't, but we almost never make the distinction consciously. In anti-work discourse, people are hardly ever arguing over the same terms, with people on the opposing side generalizing all productive activities requiring exertion. Some might make a particular distinction between work and working for a capitalist under capitalism, but they might still ascribe particular aspects of the conception of work that is specific to work under capitalism to the other activities that they still conceive of as work, even though they don't articulate it in their everyday language. Consider, for instance, the Protestant work ethic. How many times, when one thinks of tasks that need to be done as work, are they attributing that ethos to those tasks? Discipline, a valorization of hard work, and production for the sake of production? Even a task like chopping wood will bear no similarity to that conception if your time is taken, if you're doing it on your own accord, and if you are only producing the amount that is necessary to produce. Under those conditions, chopping wood can be calming, meditative, and effortless. And if we are considering the definition of work requiring effort, can we say such a task is work? Some have posited that there's a distinction to be made between work and labor. Setting aside the etymology showing that there's a convergence of the two terms, I don't find it compelling simply on the grounds of common use. The two are used interchangeably, and language should be analyzed on the basis that it's a social phenomenon that emerges from everyday discursive practices. One can make the assertion that the distinction should be made, but they can't make the assertion that it is made or that it will be made, as if imposing it on the social sphere from without when, in reality, we are all immersed within the social sphere as it shapes itself and sweeps us along with the tide. The word work, as it flowed through time and through different social and cultural contexts, has dissolved within its globule body the various influences in each context, most of which were problematic, while some either became advertently due to class interest or inadvertently sterile, but nonetheless has arrived, with many vestigial limbs attached, into our current sociocultural context, dominated by a form of production that requires every aspect of life to be viewed through the lens of this specific form of work. In Marxian theory, concrete labor refers to the production of use values, or producing the product, and abstract labor refers to the production of value. Abstract labor has an interesting character due to the fact that value is intrinsically social. It requires the exchange of commodities and social mediation in order to manifest. Abstract labor is labor as a commodity that is realized through the exchange of labor, also inherently social, producing a value for labor that becomes homogeneous throughout society. Moishe Postone writes, "It is the externalized social bond among individuals which results from the simultaneous determination of labor as a productive activity and as a socially mediating activity. In this sense, workers are compelled by a system of production in which they must sell their labor in order to have access to the commodities produced by others, including the necessities of life needed for survival. It is clear to see that this is coercive, and being coercive is a form of social domination." Postone remarks, "In capitalism, social labor is not only the object of domination and exploitation, but is itself the essential ground of domination. The non-personal, abstract, objective form of domination, characteristic of capitalism, apparently is related intrinsically to the domination of the individuals by their social labor. Even though concrete labor doesn't produce exchange value, it still takes on a social character itself. It does this through the combined efforts of the workers through their combined labor power. Capitalists don't merely benefit from the labor power of an individual worker, but of the combined efforts of a group of workers whose combined labor power is greater than the sum of the labor power of the individual workers. This benefit that capitalists receive takes the form of use values, or, in other words, the material output of production." Postone elaborates, "The process by which labor's productive powers become capitals is one of alienation and is central to Marx's analysis of capital. I previously analyzed alienation in terms of the abstract dimension of labor as a socially mediating activity. I am now referring to the alienation of the social dimension of concrete labor as productive activity. Both processes are constitutive of capital. As these processes of alienation develop, the workers are subsumed under and incorporated into capital. They become a particular mode of its existence. We now have an idea of how, within the economic context of capitalism, capital has shaped labor, and how labor is constituted and mediated by social relations, resulting in forms of domination, not by a particular group or class, but by a system of social labor. However, it isn't merely the case that this form is limited to a material or economic sphere. Later in the book, Postone writes, "We have seen that Marx's category of capital cannot be understood in material terms alone, that is, in terms of the factors of production controlled by the capitalists, nor can it be grasped fully in terms of the social relation between the capitalist and working classes, structured by private ownership of the means of production and mediated by the market. Rather, the category of capital refers to a peculiar sort of social relation, to a dynamic, totalistic, and contradictory social form that is constituted by labor in its duality, as an activity mediating people's relations with each other and with nature." What seems to be indicated by this passage is that our relationship with labor has become central to our entire culture in a dynamic and totalistic way. Postone continues, "The dialectic wherein each new level of productivity is redetermined as its base level of the abstract temporal frame of reference, which functions as a socially general compelling norm, can be conceptualized as a process in which the social character of labor as a productive activity structurally becomes an attribute of the totality, and although constituted by social practice, is opposed to and dominates the individuals." What I want to reflect on here is what I had mentioned earlier concerning our use of the word work in contemporary society. The dominant form of work resembles our relationship to our jobs within capitalism, and those jobs take on the form of both concrete and abstract labor, as discussed within Marxian theory. I'd like to take a look at one more framework on this topic before I move on. In 1,000 Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari, they also take a look at the centrality of work in capitalist culture. They write, "During the 19th century, a twofold elaboration was undertaken of a physico-scientific concept of work, weight, height, force, displacement, and of a socio-economic concept of labor power or abstract labor, a homogeneous abstract quantity applicable to all work and susceptible to multiplication and division. There was a profound link between physics and sociology. Society furnished an economic standard of measure for work, and physics a mechanical currency for it. The wage regime had as its correlate a mechanics of force. Physics had never been more social, for in both cases, it was a question of defining the constant mean value of a force of lift and pull exerted in the most uniform way possible by a standard man." Here they demonstrate how science, sociology, and physics in this example were subsumed by the economic norms surrounding work that became dominant throughout the 19th century. All frameworks of perceiving the world are brought within and enclosed within a specific economic framework. This leaks out and bleeds into the lives of all the subjects existing within the capitalist system. They continue, "Impose the work model upon every activity. Translate every act into possible or virtual work. Discipline free action or else, which amounts to the same thing. Relegate it to leisure, which exists only by reference to work. We now understand why the work model, in both its physical and social aspects, is a fundamental part of the state apparatus." Again, we see how work becomes all-encompassing and totalizing. Even the concept of leisure time exists merely in its relation to work. It is that short period of time in the day that we get to have to ourselves after we clock out of the mandatory work period and before we have to wake up in the morning to go right back. This flow, as it is central and totalizing, is encapsulated and directed by the state. With this understanding of work, how it shapes our society and how it influences how we conceptualize work, I wanted to revisit the distinction I made earlier between the dominant and passive usage of the term. Although it is clear that the word isn't necessarily used in the same way in all contexts, it is clear, as capitalism has a habit of doing, that it has been co-opted and enveloped within its gelatinous body. As Deleuze and Guattari had stated, the work model is imposed on every activity. There is a sort of ambiguity that occurs with the different variations of context where the term work is used that obscures how, regardless of context, it still exists in relation to the work model. The work of an artist or writer is the creation of the artist or writer commodified. Even in circumstances where the project at hand isn't being commodified, you still have to consider expenses, for which you must go to work to afford, and measure the activity in accordance to labor time that you need to manage during those limited hours of leisure you have before having to go back to work. Even labor time, or time abstracted for the measurement of labor, is specific to capitalism, which was pointed out by Postone in Time, Labor, and Social Domination. Before that point in history, activity was the measure of time, and it wasn't until commodity exchange came to fruition in the late feudal period, during its transition to capitalism, that time began to measure labor. This ambiguity is the cause of all the confusion you see in anti-work discourse. Why would you abolish work? You would still have to work to meet your needs after capitalism. But as you can see, this response is still limited to the modern conceptual lens. Much of what we view as work isn't necessarily work per se. It definitely doesn't help that there are socialists and anarchists that use this same framework in their theory. For example, Kropotkin in The Conquest of Bread speaks at length about necessary labor time. In his defense, he did spend considerable time focusing on the importance of making work pleasurable, but the very concept of necessary labor time reproduces specifically capitalist productivist conditions. On the subject of socialism, more specifically traditional Marxism, Postone had this to say. Thus, one variant of traditional Marxism became an ideology of legitimation for those social forms, the actually existing socialist countries, in which the liberal bourgeois mode of distribution was abolished, but the capital-determined mode of production was not, and the abolition of the former served ideologically to veil the existence of the latter. If we are serious about ending the ways in which we are dominated under capitalism, we can't forsake the modes of production, our attitudes toward production, and the way we conceive of work as a whole. I'm not suggesting that we go back to definitions of work that existed before capitalism. As was demonstrated in the last paragraph, those entailed forms of domination as well, and though they were forms that differed from capitalism due to existing in different conditions and relations of production, they were forms of domination nonetheless. What I'm saying is that we need to abolish work in its entirety, and to explain that, I'd like to talk about the game that's been serving as the footage for this video. Graveyard Keeper is an interesting game, and not just because there's a communist donkey. Yes, there's a talking communist donkey down in the table! In this game, your character is implied to have been hit by a car where you are mysteriously transported to some medieval village, greeted first thing by a mysterious and somewhat nefarious talking skull. The skull forces you into the role of the village graveyard keeper, and also demands alcohol for whatever reason. You are forced to bury bodies in exchange for burial certificates that you exchange for the local currency in order to purchase things you need. Very much the typified commodification of labor I've been speaking of. In fact, this entire game is based around work. There isn't a single moment, aside from talking to NPCs, when you aren't working, but that isn't entirely true. You, the player, aren't working. Your character is. You are playing a game, and it's fun. But why is that the case? The degree of separation from having to physically exert yourself isn't the case because there are various examples of work in our society that are mentally draining and miserable that don't require physical activity. In a video game, given the textbook definition of work, you are technically engaged in an activity where you invest energy and effort into attaining a particular goal or accomplishment, but it is still considered an example of play as opposed to work. For this, I think we can deduce a few reasons. The first of which is due to the fact that you chose to play the game. Nobody is coercing you into playing the game. The second reason is that you are not compelled to complete the game in any given time frame. You get to choose how fast and how long you play it. The activity is determining the time rather than time determining the activity. Taking these two things into account, it stands to reason that the fact that this activity is play as opposed to work is because it isn't socially mediated. Completing the game isn't a prerequisite to having access to resources you need to survive, and you aren't held accountable by anyone around you to hold yourself to a completion used in place of production schedule. Obviously, you have to complete the game within the constraints of how the game was designed to be completed, but that's no different from having to complete any activity you engage with according to the laws of physics. Also, one can argue that you enjoy the game because of the various incentives they offer. But incentives exist for any activity whether they are internally or externally motivated, and they don't always lend to enjoyment of the particular activity. The player's relationship to a game about work isn't the only interesting thing this game has to offer to an analysis of work. There are some interesting mechanics as well that are quite revealing. Although the character you play as exists in the context of an economy based on commodity exchange, the game doesn't necessarily leave you with that as your only option of progression. You can get almost everything you need yourself, and there is an engaging gameplay loop of acquiring skill points to invest in new skills that allows you to build newer, more complex and interesting things that allow you to make even more of the needed materials. On top of this, there is no time requirement to get each task done. There is an energy meter that you have to maintain by eating or sleeping, and there are NPCs that are only available on certain days, but they will always be around once those days come up again. This gives you a sense of freedom. With excess materials though, you would lose motivation to continue to play the game, but that's where the NPCs come in. They all have particular requests for certain items, and you can give these items to the characters to improve their perception of you, along with the added benefit of getting a story or narrative progression. These sorts of exchanges don't involve currency or commodity exchange, and you don't need to complete them to get the things you need. Most of them you don't need to do at all. But they are rewarding. These activities in which you produce things you need and give the excess to others in the community freely to foster connection is free from any form of domination or coercion. With the right technology applied to ease physical exertion and time expenditure, it is far from anything that could be considered work in the modern or historical sense. It could be considered play, or as Deleuze and Guattari put it, where there is no state and no surplus labor, there is no work model either. Instead, there is the continuous variation of free action, passing from speech to action, from given action to another, from action to song, from song to speech, from speech to enterprise, all in a strange chromaticism, with intense but rare peak moments or moments of effort that the outside observer can only translate in terms of work. Instead of an economy of work, we'll have an economy of hobbies. Each autonomous individual, according to their needs and desires and according to their own time, will create what they want or need if they have the ability, and share with those in their commune according to what they want or need, especially if they suffer from a disability and are unable to provide for themselves. What often comes as a surprise to those who argue against this arrangement is that we have the capacity to reproduce modern technology, and since currently existing medicine and technology won't simply disappear when capitalism has been overcome, we can and will reappropriate it. The technology will most likely be improved upon by those who find their thrill in building, experimentation, and innovation, and it can be utilized to make various tasks much easier and more efficient. There is no need for any systemic coercion. There is no need for any necessary labor time. There is no need for capital, for state, for hierarchy, and especially for work. I don't think the concept of work can be redeemed. Due to the way it has been shaped through history and in turn has shaped social consciousness, It has defined the ways we have associated with certain tasks and activities in a way that dominates us. The way we use language corresponds with our attitudes and behavioral tendencies. If I want to grow food for myself and my community, regardless of the fact that food is a necessity, I don't want to do it merely for some external coercive obligation. I want to do it for the joy of the activity in itself, and for the joy of providing for others. Some, like Kropotkin, might have the impulse to think of work as something they find joy in doing, but those with Stockholm Syndrome may also have the impulse to love their captor. If we want to create a better world, we have to readjust our attitudes toward behavioral norms that have been codified in our modern society. We have to negate the concept. We have to refuse to work. I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm okay.